Picture this moment in time. The year is 70 after Christ. Smoke rises from what was once the most magnificent temple on earth. Roman soldiers march through Jerusalem's broken streets. They don't realize they've just witnessed the fulfillment of a prophecy spoken 40 years earlier. But zoom forward with me. Fast forward through centuries of exile, persecution, and wandering. Leap across nearly 2,000 years of history. Now, we're standing in Tel Aviv on May 14, 1948. A man named David Ben-Gurion rises to speak words that will shock the world. The State of Israel has been established. Between these two moments lies the most impossible story in human history. A story that defies every rule of sociology, every pattern of conquest, every expectation of survival. What happened in those 2 millennia? How does a people lose everything and somehow return home? How does a nation disappear from maps and reappear stronger than before? Tonight, we're going to trace the most extraordinary journey ever documented. A journey that transforms exile into homecoming, tragedy into triumph, and despair into the greatest comeback story ever told. In our first episode, we discovered how God selected Abraham from ancient Mesopotamia. We watched divine promises unfold across generations through Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. We witnessed the Egyptian slavery, the miraculous Exodus, and the conquest of Canaan. We saw how this small nation became the stage for something cosmic. The birth of Christ in Bethlehem, the crucifixion and resurrection, the gospel spreading throughout the Roman Empire. Everything seemed perfectly orchestrated according to divine plan. But then came disaster. Roman legions surrounded Jerusalem. The temple was destroyed. The people were scattered to the ends of the earth. Critics wondered if God's promises had failed. Had the ancient covenant been broken forever? What followed next reveals why this particular people became God's chosen vessel for blessing all nations. If you're fascinated by how history and prophecy intersect with such precision, consider subscribing to help us bring more life-changing biblical content to seekers around the world. Your subscription is free, but has eternal value. It helps YouTube show this content to more hungry hearts who need to discover these incredible connections. When Roman battering rams finally broke through Jerusalem's walls, historian Flavius Josephus recorded scenes of unimaginable devastation. Families had been eating leather during the siege. Bodies filled the streets. The holy city lay in ruins. But here's where the extraordinary begins. Instead of simply vanishing like other conquered peoples, something unprecedented occurred. The Jewish survivors carried their sacred scrolls, their religious calendar, and their collective memory wherever they went. They established communities in Babylon, building on foundations laid centuries earlier during the first exile. They sailed to Alexandria in Egypt, creating one of the ancient world's greatest centers of learning. They traveled north to Rome itself, establishing synagogues in the heart of the empire that had destroyed their homeland. In each location, they did something remarkable. They created portable sanctuaries. Without a temple, they made their homes into sacred spaces. Without a homeland, they made their communities into micronations. Without political power, they created educational systems that would outlast empires. Every Friday night, in homes across the Mediterranean world, they lit candles and blessed bread. Every spring, they celebrated Passover with the same ritual words. Next year, in Jerusalem. Century after century, that phrase echoed in dining rooms from Spain to Persia. They were the first people in history to create a civilization based on books rather than territory, on ideas rather than armies, on memory rather than monuments. During Europe's Dark Ages, Jewish communities became islands of literacy in an ocean of ignorance. In Muslim Spain, they produced philosophers like Maimonides, whose writings influenced Christian, Islamic, and Jewish thought for centuries. They developed an educational system unlike anything the world had seen. Every Jewish child, even the poorest, learned to read. This in an era when most European nobility was illiterate. They created networks of scholars, merchants, and craftsmen that stretched from England to India. But prosperity bred envy. When the First Crusade was launched in 1096, something horrific happened along the route to Jerusalem. Crusaders decided to attack enemies of Christ closer to home. Entire Jewish communities in the Rhineland were given a choice: convert or die. Many chose death rather than abandon their faith. Parents embraced their children and walked into flames together. Communities that had flourished for centuries were wiped out in days. Yet survivors regrouped elsewhere and rebuilt. The 14th century brought an even greater test. When the Black Death swept across Europe, desperate populations needed someone to blame. Jews were accused of poisoning wells, despite dying from the plague themselves. In Strasbourg, 2,000 people were burned alive in a single pyre. But here's the mystery that puzzles historians. After each catastrophe, the survivors somehow reconstituted their communities. They rebuilt their synagogues, reopened their schools, and continued their ancient practices. In 1492, Ferdinand and Isabella expelled all Jews from Spain. 200,000 people had 4 months to leave or convert. Families that had lived in Spain for over 1,000 years lost everything overnight. Where did they go? To the Ottoman Empire, where the Sultan welcomed them. To Amsterdam, where they helped build a commercial empire. To the New World, where they established some of America's first synagogues. The question that haunts scholars is simple: how? Every other ancient people absorbed into their host cultures within a few generations. Only this nation somehow preserved its distinct character across continents and centuries. The 19th and 20th centuries brought challenges that should have ended this remarkable story forever. In the Russian Empire, government-sponsored pogroms terrorized Jewish communities. Houses were burned, families attacked, entire neighborhoods destroyed. Between 1880 and 1920, over 2 million Eastern European Jews fled to America. They carried little more than hope and an unshakable belief that someday, somehow, they would return home. But the ultimate test was yet to come. During World War II, Nazi Germany implemented what they called the final solution. This wasn't random persecution. It was systematic, industrial, calculated destruction. The goal was simple: eliminate every Jewish person on Earth. 6 million lives were lost in what we now call the Holocaust. To grasp this magnitude, imagine the entire population of Massachusetts simply disappearing. Families that had survived every previous persecution were completely erased. Warsaw had 500,000 Jews before the war. After liberation, fewer than 200 remained. Communities that had existed for a millennium were reduced to empty buildings and mass graves. It seemed like the end of an impossible story. Hitler had declared his intention to solve the Jewish question permanently. For a moment, it appeared he had succeeded. But then, something extraordinary happened. Instead of destroying hope for a homeland, this tragedy created worldwide recognition that a safe haven was desperately needed. Global leaders who had previously dismissed Zionism as romantic fantasy began reconsidering. The Balfour Declaration of 1917, promising a Jewish national home in Palestine, suddenly gained new urgency. World opinion, horrified by the scope of genocide, began supporting the idea of Jewish statehood. If you're following this story and recognizing how seemingly disconnected events fit into a larger pattern, perhaps God is speaking to your heart today. Maybe He's showing you that He has a specific plan for your life too. Even when circumstances seem impossible, even when hope appears lost, God continues working behind the scenes. May 14, 1948. 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The Tel Aviv Museum of Art. 37 Jewish leaders gathered for a moment that would change history forever. David Ben-Gurion stood at a simple wooden podium. Outside, crowds filled the streets, sensing something monumental was about to happen. Inside, the tension was electric. Everyone knew this decision would determine whether their ancient dream would finally become reality. Ben-Gurion began reading. The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the gathering of the exiles. The words echoed through the small hall. People wept. Others shouted with joy. For the first time in 19 centuries, a Jewish state had been proclaimed. Not gradually, not after decades of preparation, in a single day. Exactly as the prophet Isaiah had written, "Who has ever heard of such things? Who has ever seen things like this? Can a country be born in a day, or a nation be brought forth in a moment?" Within hours, the United Nations recognized the new state. The United States and Soviet Union, despite their Cold War rivalry, both immediately offered recognition. Within days, Jews from around the world began returning. They came from displaced persons camps in Europe, carrying nothing but survival and hope. They came from Arab countries where they were no longer welcome. They came from every corner of the earth, speaking dozens of different languages, but sharing a common destination. Hebrew, which had been a liturgical language for 20 centuries, suddenly became the language of playgrounds and parliaments. Eliezer ben Yehuda had spent his life creating modern Hebrew words for concepts that didn't exist in biblical times. Now, children played in Hebrew, newspapers published in Hebrew, laws were written in Hebrew. A dead language had been resurrected, but the challenges had only begun. The day after independence, 5 Arab armies attacked simultaneously: Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. It was a newborn nation, with no organized military facing experienced, well-equipped forces. Israeli fighters included Holocaust survivors who had never held weapons and young pioneers who knew more about farming than fighting. They converted agricultural tractors into makeshift tanks. They used civilian training planes as fighter aircraft. Every military analyst predicted swift defeat. The Arab forces had more soldiers, more weapons, more planes, more tanks. They had logistical support from major powers. Israel had only the determination of people who had waited 20 centuries for this moment. The predicted defeat never came. Against all odds, Israel not only survived but expanded its territory. By war's end, they controlled 78% of historic Palestine, more than the UN had originally offered. Today, 75 years after that historic declaration, Israel has become one of the world's most advanced economies. It leads globally in technology, medicine, desert agriculture, and water desalination. A country smaller than New Jersey produces more technological patents than nations 10 times its size. Tel Aviv, which was sand dunes a century ago, now ranks among the world's top innovation capitals. The Negev Desert, once considered uninhabitable, now blooms with flowers exported to Europe. Israel has transformed one of Earth's smallest countries into a knowledge superpower. But perhaps most remarkable is the nation's very existence. Sociologists have studied hundreds of cases of dispersed peoples throughout history. None maintained their distinct character for more than a few generations. None ever successfully returned to their ancestral homeland after such extended exile. Armenians were scattered, but never fully returned. Roma people preserved some customs, but never established a homeland. Kurds maintained their culture, but still struggle for nationhood. Only the Jews accomplished what seemed impossible. Secular historians point to sociological factors, economic patterns, and geopolitical circumstances. All these elements played important roles. The emphasis on education they always valued, the study traditions they developed, the work ethic they cultivated, the community solidarity they preserved. But when you examine the complete picture, When you analyze 20 centuries of history panoramically, the explanation transcends purely human factors. Survival through millennia of persecution, preservation of identity across continents of dispersion, prophesied return, national rebirth against impossible odds. Ancient prophecies spoke of a restoration that would be recognized worldwide as divine intervention. They described a return that would serve as a sign to all nations. They predicted an era when the entire world would acknowledge that Israel's God is the true God. Regardless of your political positions on current Middle Eastern events, regardless of your opinions about specific governments or conflicts, the Jewish story remains an extraordinary testimony. A testimony that forces working in human history extend beyond what we see on the surface. If this story has touched you in some way, if it's made you consider how God might be working even in impossible situations, hit that like button and share in the comments which part impacted you most. Your engagement helps other people discover these fascinating connections between history and divine purpose. This is a story that continues being written, and perhaps, in some way, you're also part of this larger story that God is telling through humanity. A story of promises kept, hopes fulfilled, and miracles that challenge purely human explanations. What other biblical mystery would you like us to explore in our upcoming videos? Hit the notification bell so you never miss revelations like this. And tag someone in the comments who needs to hear this incredible story.